Welcome back to the Stay Spicy podcast. If you tuned into our last episode, you probably know what this episode is all about, because the last episode we talked about the importance of values for leadership, and we walked through how to discover your values. Sherry let me do a values discovery session with her on the podcast to demonstrate the process, and she's still sitting next to me. And so now we're going to talk about, once you've identified your values, how do you live them? And why is it important to even do that? So we have a really cool guest on today, and we're really excited. He's going to help us out with that discussion. I actually heard him speak about a year ago, and I was like, we have to have him on the podcast. So I was waiting. And I'm really glad that he said yes, because honestly, he's the best speaker I've ever heard on this topic of living your values. So we're really excited about today's episode. And so Sherry's going to introduce our guest for today.
Yes, we're excited to have Gavin John as a guest on the Stay Spicy podcast. So Gavin, you're a journalist, writer, and photographer with over a decade of experience covering topics on conflict, unrest, Indigenous affairs, and humanitarian concerns. Some of your most recent work has been covering the Pope's apology for the residential school system, as well as documenting Indigenous representation in the Canadian Armed Forces for the Globe and Mail. So Gavin, you've also been following the Canadian Armed Forces on NATO training exercises, and you've taken a particular interest recently from, covering conflicts like the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. So from our earlier conversations with you, you're a big advocate for what you say is ethical journalism. And I know we need a lot more of that. And that definitely makes you a great candidate to talk about living our values today on the podcast. So I just want to wish you a warm welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, it's always fun hearing. I was thinking when he said that, I was like, wow, it has been a decade. Oh my God. Yeah,
yeah, hearing your own bio is like, cool.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you. I guess, and again, like we've chatted before, but yeah, thanks for having me.
So before we get into stories, because you've got a lot of stories to tell, and we're excited for those. We might need to do an extended version of this one. But why don't we set the stage with, because we're talking all about values. So what are your core values, Gavin?
Yeah, I guess I would say there's one, the way I look at kind of core values is, and not just in relation to my work. So there's ways I interpret that, and then, I'll kind of get into how I kind of break that down. But for me, duty is a value that I prioritize really over everything else. And as this conversation goes, it'll mostly be in the context of myself as a journalist and my duty as what I believe as an ethical journalist. But duty also applies to things outside of my work. So it's my duty as a husband, my duty as a friend, my duty. So there's things that are, and the way I interpret that is, there are things that are asked of me, and there are things that are expected of me based on the role that I fulfill. So like I said, whether that's me being a journalist or a husband or a friend, there are some responsibilities that come with that. And, we'll get into it, but there's things that sometimes they aren't fun, or they're not easy. But there's a duty and a responsibility to do those things. So the way I look at it is that, in the context of my work, how does duty manifest itself in my professional career? And in my interpretation of that is ethical journalism. And, that is the embodiment of my duty to my role. So, without belaboring the point, I could talk about ethics for a long time. But to me, ethical journalism is ensuring that, my understanding of a topic or a situation, as well as being an attentive and empathetic listener to subjects, I accurately and respectfully convey stories, topics, and concepts to an audience. So whether that's, like you mentioned, most of my work right now is with the Globe and Mail, but I do have other clients. So like the Narwhal, a piece just got published yesterday that I helped work on. So making sure that my work is as representative to either a reality on the ground or a concept or something that I believe the Canadian public has a responsibility or a should know. So, that's a very ambiguous topic and a concept. So, obviously we're going to get into that, but duty, and for me in my professional career, duty to ethical journalism is definitely a core value of mine.
And I like what you said there, highlighting that values are values, no matter whether it relates to your work. You don't have different values for work as you do for personal. Your core values are core to who you are. And then you might have different interpretations of them for different parts of your life. But that's the whole point, is your values don't change. You don't adopt a set of values that is suitable for a workplace or for a role. That is just who you are. And it can change over time. That's one of the things when we were chatting before the podcast, you were talking about how a lot's changed in a year, certainly for both of us. And so can you tell us a little bit about how your values may have evolved, or maybe how you view them or apply them as evolved based on kind of changes you've seen in the world and in your own life?
Yeah, I'm absolutely. And my decade of experience, as you so put.
You don't have to go through every year of that decade.
But there's definitely been some moments, and something when it comes to ethics is something that, you develop, and it's especially in a field like journalism where there's a lot of gray area. And that gray area contains things like opinions and perspectives and, blind spots, both intentional and unintentional. Like you're wading into a minefield of things that will challenge your perspectives, your values. And so for me, there's a bunch of moments in my career where, I've made the wrong decision. I have been confronted with a situation, whether of my own making or of, outside my control, where I've made a wrong decision, or I've approached it from, now looking back, either an unethical or a way that betrays my own values. And what I think is really important is, especially in my field, it's important to recognize those moments and recognize the moments that, you kind of get wrong. Because those develop your ethics and your your values more than when you get it right. Because when you get it right, it feels good. You feel this like, oh yeah, I totally nailed that. And I can list off cases where my ethics and my actions and my values all were in line, and it feels great. I don't learn anything from that. I don't develop and hone my my values and how I uphold myself in situations like that. It's just like, yeah, good job. It's kind of the whole, you shouldn't be congratulated for doing your job. Your job is your job. That's the basic expectation of a job. But to me, the way I look, and I'll make it clear, like I'm a freelance journalist. So while I do have a contract with the Globe and Mail, I'm essentially like my own business, because I have other clients, I have other, I can pitch to whoever I want. The Globe and Mail is the one that I really enjoy working with the most, because their values and their ethics and their approach to journalism matches my interpretation the most. So that's one thing too, that I make sure that my interactions with individuals and companies match my values, because it becomes less of a maybe a liability of values when I'm working with people who don't match my values. So, but because I'm my own business, I have to develop I don't have a code of ethics that I can just pull up and be like, okay, how do I interpret this situation? I have to develop that on my own. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about changes, there's moments where, like, as everyone does in their youth, I went to North Korea when I was 20.
Didn't we all?
Didn't we all? 20, 25, 26.
It's a different version of rebellion.
Right? Yeah. looking back on that, that's probably one of the most irresponsible and unethical things that I've done in my career. And both from a personal safety, both from like the question of I have to acknowledge that I gave money to probably one of the most oppressive regimes in the world, directly funded. And that's something that sits wrong with me. And it felt wrong when I did it, and it felt wrong when I was there, and it definitely felt wrong when I was back. So there was a misalignment in values there, because for me, I have a worldview that prioritizes things like human rights and an understanding of the world that we live in through the lens of a liberal world order. So freedom of speech, freedom to associate, all those things. North Korea definitely isn't that. So it definitely was a moment that, I put myself into risk that the payoff wasn't worth it. So for photos, like no photo is worth my life, worth the lives of other people. And there's an unethical approach to journalism where it's essentially like trauma porn. There's the people of North Korea didn't benefit from my work.
Right.
The people of North Korea didn't even really know of my work. It was an ego project, if that makes sense. So that was something that, I learned hard, and that was a hard lesson. And I made money from it, sure, but it didn't feel right. So then there was that reevaluation of like, okay, why did that feel wrong? And how can I do better? So as you mentioned, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. So my focus has always been, really since I was young, I always wanted to be a journalist. And I wanted to understand war and conflict and unrest. Long story short, my parents raised me. We watched the news every day. And so I thank them from the bottom of my heart for, introducing me to the concepts outside of Strathmore, Alberta. And it's things like the Rwandan genocide and the Gulf War, and these moments in the 90s where I was fascinated and terrified of these tragedies. And in high school, I watched 9/11 live and on TV. So that was a moment where it really kind of solidified. It's like, no, I want to understand this. I want to understand why this happened, and I also want to, I love telling stories. So for me, it was this I want to tell stories about this stuff. So in my career, then it was this focus of I want to, the war in Iraq was at its height, and I wanted to report on that. And my first tour was in 2015, and that was during the war against the Islamic State, and that was, I guess, my first combat tour as a journalist. And kind of, it's scary. I don't know if that's the biggest understatement of, kind of getting my feet underneath me. And learning firsthand, I got to know some people when I was there, and in the years that followed, I had people that I knew die. And so that was another lesson where it's like, okay, this isn't, these ego projects that I had mentioned, these have real life consequences for people. And the emotions that came with losing somebody due to war, was tough, another lesson. And so then there was this, okay, how do I be responsible, and how do I be, someone that honors these perspectives and these stories and this trust that people show me as a journalist, because I have to build trust with people very quick, and that's something that I have to honor, especially when these people pass away. So in 2016, when I went back for my second tour during the Battle of Mosul to retake it from the Islamic State, there was this moment where I really realized that I was kind of out of my league, where it wasn't the context of got to be safe, and here's the safety procedures, but the context of the war. And it bothered me because, like I said, I want to make sure I'm contributing something to the Canadian and global public as a journalist. And there's this concept in journalism called parachute journalism. And it's essentially when a journalist is just dropped in a country that they know I don't say very little. Well, okay, yeah, the scale. But they know little of. And their analysis and interpretations is very surface level. And something as complex as Middle Eastern conflict, you can't do that. You can't come at a surface level interpretation of something so complex. So when it comes to, so I looked at that and I was like, okay, well, how do I ensure that my approach of, what would an ethical journalist do? And for me, it was going back to school. It was making sure that I had armed myself with an academic knowledge to be able to speak on things as complex as Middle Eastern affairs. because I saw a lot of examples of journalists, and throughout this talk, there are more, I'm sure we all know, there's more than enough examples of journalists that speaking out of, not from a place of authority, and speaking from a place of opinion. And when we talk about war, where emotions are incredibly high and people have very visceral reactions to concepts and ideas, like, you have to have a basis and a strong foundation. And to me, I know one thing, if I don't live to my values, if I don't have that commitment to my core values, what do I have? When I'm out of my league, and when I don't have that basis, I have nothing to fall back on. So for me, I looked at, my work from Iraq, and I'm really proud of it. But I was like, no, I can't continue to do work without being educated more on the subject. So I took a 4-year pause from my career, and I went and got an international relations degree with focus on strategic studies. And regionally, I did Middle Eastern studies. So I really, really committed to it. So that brings me now to kind of where I am now in my career. I started doing a lot of work for the Globe and Mail. And especially now with the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East, like this desire and this need for ethical journalism is like just screaming at me. Where it's like there are so many people out there, and so many journalists, whether through intention or not, are either dumbing down or misinterpreting or not understanding or speaking out outside of their expertise on subjects that are incredibly important for the public to understand. So for me, that's been a huge motivator, and I've to understand the Canadian Armed Forces requires time and building relationships, and even in the actually look at here my bio, I can add another one. I just got back from 2 weeks up in Cambridge Bay on the Northwest Passage. I'm doing a piece on Arctic security and sovereignty issues around the Northwest Passage. That's a big topic, and I take my job very seriously, because there's things that we have to understand as Canadians, whether we like to or not. And I think this is the thing that when I talk about something that's changed over the past year, is that the world isn't getting safer. The world isn't getting better. In fact, it's getting worse. And the experts that I listen to, and the experts that I trust in their opinions all across the political spectrum, are all pointing towards either global conflict or a drastic escalation.
I think too, like there's a lot of reporting right now, and we talk a lot about that. There's a lot of information, a lot of reporting, a lot of opinions, but there's not a lot of journalism. And, growing up watching the Gulf War on TV, I had an aunt who was a peacekeeper in Bosnia. So just a lot of watching those embedded journalists trying really hard to take the time to understand the culture, to report on it. I think I was a bit naive to think that technology would kind of give us more access to that kind of truth and people being able to use their values to communicate that truth. But unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. So how do you balance that? Like in a world where you've seen so much conflict, so many different experiences, how do you stay sort of grounded in your values, drive forward despite, all of that? Because sometimes that's disheartening, I think.
Yeah. Oh, this is the podcast of understatements. Trademark that. That's good. Yeah. So
it's our next podcast.
It's difficult. And part of it has to be, I have my own biases, and any journalist that says they don't have biases is lying. That's a reality. But the way I look at it is, I need to make sure that, on things that I feel strongly towards, I have to temper my own opinion, because I don't believe that my responsibility as a journalist isn't to tell people my opinion. People don't want opinion. There's so many opinions, like on the internets, on Twitter or X, whatever they call it, or, there's TikTok, and like the technology that we have today has enabled people to literally scream at the void. And it's the death of expertise. We no longer have this, okay, well, I don't know about the conduct of hostilities and international armed conflict and law around something as complex as that. and now it's just like everybody has an opinion on that. Everybody can say like, well, this is genocide, or this is a war crime, or this is illegal, or this is without backing it up, because we have that ability to put it out there. So the way I look at it, I have a responsibility, even though I myself am opinionated. I ground my opinions in my experiences and my education, but I know that it does push me certain directions. So I'm very conscious of it. So the way I look at it is I try and limit my sharing of my opinion, because the way I look at it is my opinion doesn't matter. If somebody wants to know about Arctic security and why the Northwest Passage, is probably one of Canada's most strategic bodies of water, like, why would people give a shit what Gavin John says? They just want to know why. Like, why is Canada the only country in the world that recognizes it as internal waters? Everybody else doesn't. Similarly, like I said, the laws of armed conflict. Like, I have opinions, but why would somebody give a shit what Gavin John thinks about international armed conflict? I want to be able to explain, like, this is a law and this is how people have interpreted, lawyers and experts. Mm-hmm. I'm educated on things, but I'm not an expert. I develop my opinion through those moments. And this is the whole thing about echo chambers online, is that if you just sit in your own echo chamber, you're learning nothing. So similar to my development of my values, I develop my opinion and my approach to ethical journalism by trying to search out those opposing views.
I really love your perspective that you brought, where values are shaped through being challenged, not just by kind of living them. And so every time you go against your values, or every time something challenges your values, you learn more, and then you can further define your values, right? Because you get more information, just like you said with your opinions, you get more information, and you can further define things. And I think your examples when it comes to these conflicts is whether it's war, unarmed conflict, or just day-to-day life, there's nothing that is black and white. Mm-hmm. And so it's all shades of gray, it's nuance. And when it comes to values, you have to be the one to define your own values, and you have to take in the information and everything is a decision. Even not deciding is a decision. So do you have? I was really fascinated by that story of North Korea, and then just being put in a position where you either were asked to do something outside your values, or you made a decision to. Do you have other examples of where your values were maybe challenged?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and how that shaped them, I guess.
2015, when I was in Iraq. I was in Kirkuk, so a city in central Iraq, and this was during the ISIS was still on the offensive, and what had happened was there's essentially something called the SIS, which is the Kurdish secret police. So I was embedded with Kurdish units in northern Iraq on the defensive against ISIS, and I was working with a colleague. And an opportunity, we had somebody reach out to us from this Kurdish unit and said, we've got an ISIS prisoner of war, and would you like to interview them? So as a journalist, this is a potential, great story, and at the time there was this desire to understand firsthand why people had joined ISIS. So ISIS prisoners were few and far between. So it's that question of, like, do you interview them? And the publications that I had been in communication with, like, all of them were like, if you can get an interview with an ISIS prisoner of war, take it. We will pay whatever it takes. This is like I said, early in the war against ISIS. So the money was there. But it didn't sit right with me. Because there's things that, as a journalist, I have to make sure that, I am not. Wow, we are understating. So this is buckle up for this understatement. Nobody wants to do a war crime,
right?
So something like interviewing a prisoner of war is a war crime, and there's a lot of things, because a prisoner of war, regardless if they're a jihadi or a Russian soldier, it does not matter. Because once you are a prisoner, you should be afforded all basically rights afforded to you, being you're not to be used as propaganda. You're not to be used. Your face and your likeness aren't to be shown without your consent, for the safety of your family, and for like all these things. Like there's a grocery list of checks and balances. So for me, it was this question of like, okay, I need to make sure, can you confirm these following questions? And I replied back to them of like, can you confirm that I can speak with this prisoner alone, without a minder? Have they been coached? Can you confirm to me that they have not been put under duress? Is this voluntary? Are they consenting to it? All these things. Because the context in interviewing a prisoner of war is very narrow. And of course they couldn't verify any of that. They're like, nope, can't verify any of that. Would you like to interview him or not? So obviously no, for me. Because like I said, when I'm in a tricky position and I'm in a, tough, like, what do? I fall back to my values. And it's the duty to be an ethical journalist. And everything was screaming at me, don't. Like, that's not it. So, like, my values bailed me out of that. And to me, it's not about money. I could have made money on that, but a few $1,000s goes away pretty quick. But in the end, I want to be remembered as an ethical journalist, as someone who made the right decisions in very difficult situations. I want to make sure I'm respectful to subjects in, like I said, in horrible times. So it's, Iraq was very formative for me. So fast forwarding now to, my work with like Indigenous affairs. I'm Indigenous myself, so there's when we talk about bias in that perspective, my own background and identity does inform how I cover those stories. But I want to make sure that I'm removing myself and making sure that topics are covered from a respectful perspective, because God knows how Indigenous people have been portrayed in my own industry over the years. It's been horrific. Poverty porn and addictions and trauma and all these things that, of course, those are issues that we're facing. But there's ways to respectfully tell them, and especially with photographs. Like I've you mentioned the Pope's visit. That was a very formative event. But I've done stories on addictions in First Nations, and there's ways to do it respectfully and with consent and informed consent. That is something, an action that I can directly tie to my values as my duty to be an ethical journalist. I can directly tie, like, informed consent is very important to me in like 90% of my work. So it's all those things that, the longer I go on in my career, the more I have these opportunities to be like, okay, I'm on a First Nation and I'm with paramedics and somebody's going through a fentanyl withdrawal. How do I respectfully tell this story? How do I respectfully, capture this moment? How do I, it's informed to make sure that the person knows why I'm there, and if they don't feel like it's these in the moment, and they're difficult questions, because as a photographer, and especially as a photojournalist, there are moments to capture, and I have lost count of how many moments I've chosen not to capture, even though the photo would have been like great,
front page, yep,
sure, yeah. Mm-hmm. But once again, like the prisoner of war story, is I want to make sure that in the end I look at a story and I'm proud of it. Mm-hmm. I look at a picture and I'm proud of it. And I say, okay, I got that in an ethical way. So it's these little moments and these little kind of checking in with yourself. And it's I find that, and it's also taking time, and it's ensuring that I'm making the right decisions. I'm not rushing things. When I do talks at SAIT to some of the first-year journalism students, I say that journalism, and especially photojournalism, isn't actually about photography. It's not about, writing a good lead or, getting that great, rule of thirds and all these kind of it's interpersonal relations. If you can't make somebody trust you, and if you can't show that you are genuine, that your intentions are transparent, that they know why you're there, and that they're okay with it, and, that takes time. Some people aren't going to trust you, and I am not entitled to anybody's time. I'm not entitled to anybody's story. That has to be built with trust, and especially like with my work with the Canadian Armed Forces, like soldiers are frosty people. They can be a bit frosty, and especially towards journalists, because there has been, once again, so many cases of journalists covering conflict that puts soldiers in compromising positions. And they have that right to believe that. And they have the right not to trust me. And in fact, I would prefer that. Like, let me prove it to you. Let me prove that you can trust me. So it's why, like, when I do pieces, like I was in Estonia, you mentioned, doing a piece on Canada and NATO, I was embedded with a mechanized infantry unit for 2 weeks. Because that's how I told my editors, that's how long it's going to take to tell the story responsibly. Up in the Arctic, 2 weeks. That's how long it's going to take for me to tell the story responsibly, to get to know the soldiers, to be able to convey this story through personal, like, interviews. And, you know, you can't just show up for 2 hours, throw a microphone in somebody's face and tell them to act natural. Like, that's not, you can't do that. So, yeah, so it's all this kind of learning. You know, I don't know to what end. I don't know to be the most ethical, but yeah.
Well, to the end of being able to look back and be proud of how you showed up. And I think that's, regardless of what someone's values are, that's what it's all about, is being able to look at your behavior in life, in work, and say, I'm proud of how I showed up there. And we all make decisions, and we all have situations where we aren't aligned with our values. And that resonates with me, that whole feeling of like, oh, this isn't right. Yeah. And or you look back and you go, yeah, that I wasn't my best self there. And any time I've thought that, it's always because I was in a situation where I either went against my values, I wasn't acting in accordance with my values, or I was in an environment that didn't align with my values. I also want to, first of all, thank you for being so open about those decisions, right? Because it's hard for anybody to say, oh, I fucked up there, let alone something as extreme as I went to North Korea. And I think it's important for us to be able to talk about, that's what this podcast is about, right? Being able to talk about these kinds of topics. But it also, I think it's important to be able to dissect those moments ourselves, to figure out, okay, how do I know next time? And, in a workplace context, people might be thinking, well, okay, how is this relevant to me? I'm not going to be in Iraq, and
please don't.
it's like, yeah, probably not. But this is really applicable to everyday life. I've been in workplace environments, and I've had other people talk to me about their experiences, and we may not identify it as a values misalignment. It's, it shows up sometimes as depression, or health issues, lack of sleep. You talked about being able to sleep at night. And it can show up in a lot of different ways. But when we have these extreme sort of mental and physical reactions, we may not see it at the time, but often it's because there's a values misalignment there. And we're making decisions, even by not making decisions, we're making decisions to be in a place that we shouldn't be. How does that manifest for you when you're in these, because you said you could feel it?
Yeah. Well, great question, because I'm currently going through that one of those situations where I'm trying to figure it out, and it's around the current conflict in Gaza, and I'm in a really weird position, like in my own kind of, I'll let you in my brain for a sec here, because like I mentioned earlier, when it comes to social media, there's no shortage of opinion, and there's no shortage of very strong opinions that are diametrically opposed to each other. A lot of these opinions you cannot have simultaneously, and even through wading through that, obviously I have my own opinions, and I believe it's informed from, like I said, my education, my personal experience. Where I fit in that, I don't know. It's daunting. We're talking about one of the most controversial conflicts in the world, and I'm just little old me, but I need to be able to have these conversations, because there's not many people going back to being an ethical journalist, I don't find that there's many ethical approaches to this war. A lot of more publications get it wrong than get it right. So whether or not swinging so far to one, so Al Jazeera on the pro-Palestinian side, or CNN on the pro-Israeli side, it's a shooting gallery in there of opinions. So where do I fit? I don't know, but it feels awkward for me.
Well, and what I hear from a lot of these these conversations and leadership conversations is, you know, the struggle to be human, right? The work that it takes to be human, and to look for humanity in situations, rather than just, you know, get the job done kind of thing. What does leadership look like in this space then, in terms of humanity?
That's a good question, because the way I interpret it, I would say like leadership is being able to articulate an opinion or a perspective in an effective way to your audience. You know, whether that's, they don't have to agree with you. Like, I don't want people to agree with me, kind of going back to that, like, tell me why I'm wrong, but let's hopefully do it in a respectful way. But my responsibility and my duty as a journalist is to make sure that I'm communicating what I believe in an effective way, so that someone goes, I see why Gavin believes that. I see where he's drawing that information from. I disagree with him because X, Y, Z, you know, whatever opinion they have. And then that creates the ground for conversation. That creates the ground for, like, how do we figure this out? And that's not exclusive to journalism. That's not exclusive to Israel. I literally picked the most difficult situation. But having, like, your responsibility as a communicator, whether that's in a leadership role or journalistic role, or like you guys are podcasters, you know, you have a responsibility, in my opinion, like my duty, to communicate effectively so that your message gets across, and then you can have that, like, and why do you agree with me? Why do you disagree with you? You know, where is that? And find that almost arena of ideas. Mm-hmm. Find where that is, you know, because if we're just shouting over each other, we're not meeting anywhere. You know, it becomes an argument, and it becomes this, like, it's not productive, which is why, once again, I don't think, you know, I want to really wade into the social media, but maybe I have to. So it's like to me, leadership is that, not only communicating, but finding where that common ground is, that we can have that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's part of why we decided to do the podcast, is we wanted to have conversations that people weren't having in a real, open and honest way, and bring different perspectives to topics. And we've brought our own values to this as well, right? We talked earlier before we got on about how we've chosen not to seek out sponsors because we want to be independent. Mm-hmm. And want to create a platform for other people to have those conversations as well. So you've made it so clear. It's funny how sometimes we do these things and we don't think about them as values-based, but values are basically your guide for decision making. And like you said, so what I took from today, well, first of all, was I was right. We could have done this for like 2 more hours, but because we're out of time already. But some of the big things I took from you today, Gavin, were you learn a lot when your values are challenged. Mm-hmm. In fact, you learn the most when your values are challenged. And when you make a decision that's outside your values, sit in that and examine it, because that's where the magic happens in terms of really defining your values. Yeah. Ask questions, take your time. That's another thing I heard from you, is take your time. You don't have to make a decision on someone else's timeline. Yeah. And in fact, if somebody's pressuring you to, it's probably a red flag. Yep. And then also be able to clearly communicate your values and make a series of criteria, essentially. As a leader, it's up to you to make those decisions that align with your values, especially, this is the other thing I took from you, especially when you're the one standing alone, like the cheese stands alone. Is how I see it. You, just because everybody around you is going one way doesn't mean you have to, if that's not what your values say. Yep. And so it's both, I interpret it as both the easiest thing you can do and the hardest thing you can do to live your values. Yeah,
100%.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add too is it's always helpful to have someone you can bounce ideas off of. They don't have to be, you know, a coworker. It can be like your wife or husband or friend or someone a confidant. You know, my wife is such an invaluable person. Like, she's the most important person in my life for that. Like, that's one of the reasons, because it's sometimes you just need to talk it out and figure it out. Yeah. So yeah.
That's Sherry for me.
Yeah.
It's true. We call them Post-it people. It's like somebody who knows you and can call you on it and go, that's not on brand for you. That's not aligned for you. Mm-hmm. Is that really what you want to do? Because sometimes you just need that mirror put up in front of your face. Yep. Sherry's always doing that to me.
And encouraging curiosity and humanity, I think, is what we heard as well. So, you know, amazing stories today. You've given us a lot to think about, Gavin, and I really want to thank you for your time. Where can our listeners find you online and read more about you?
Not on social media, apparently.
I'm about to be a hypocrite. I'm on Instagram. It's the necessary evil of being a photojournalist, making sure. I do have my own webpage, so it's gavinbryanjohn.com. That's GavinBryanJohn.com. I update that as much as I can as I get published, and then I'm on Instagram as gjohnjournalism.
Nice.
Amazing. Thank you so much today. And thank you to all our listeners for tuning in to this amazing conversation. Stay tuned for our next episode. It is going to be another spicy conversation on leadership. Thanks again, everyone. Stay spicy.